So we have a really exciting panel planned for right now. We have three of probably the smartest people that I know with the resources that are the deep pockets of three large companies in our space, namely Equinix, Digital Realty, and KPMG. So the point behind today's session is really what's going on in terms of changes in infrastructure, compute fabric, the trends and macroeconomic situation that's driving all that. And so without further ado, let me have my panelists come out on stage. So we have Darren Yang from KPMG, we have Dave McCrory from Digital Realty, and we have Jim Poole from Equinix. Without further ado, let me start with Darren.
Thanks so much. And hi everyone, pleasure to be here and hope you had a great lunch. So quick intro, Darren, I'm based in Singapore. I work for KPMG and I look after the TMT sector for the Asia Pacific region. But prior to KPMG, I was here in IT Telecom for 20 years, so a lot of common friends in this audience today. But today I want to touch on some of the trends. And this has a great impact to many of you in the audience, so I wanted to share some of those insights. The first thing is really around the type of companies I often engage with. We engage with telcos, tech giants, hyperscalers, and then we also work with governments, fintech, private equity, anyone in that space wanting to do new things. And so some of these trends here you will see are the ones that we've summarized that really capture the future of the landscapes that we're seeing across the Asia Pacific region. So you can see some of these and they're very clear and obvious that metaverse and NFT, there was a big trend around that coming up. Crypto blockchain absolutely continues to grow, perhaps not so much on the crypto side, but on the blockchain side there's a technology around fintech, payments, all those areas. We see ESG absolutely being critical because it's either technology or ESG right now that we're seeing as major trends. 5G IoT is enablers, solving data problems, driving data, and processing all of that on platforms. So in a short way, like everything that you see up there is data orientated. So with those trends in mind, what we start to then look at and ask ourselves is, what's the future tech company look like in Asia Pacific? And so we commissioned the research, 5,500 startups, asking the question, who's the next Grab or go-to in Asia Pacific? We always hear about all the big US and European tech giants, but what's the next unicorn in Asia? 6,500 companies we studied and really trying to pick up some key trends. We picked the top 100 in Asia Pacific and the top 10 in every one of the 12 markets. And what was really interesting is when you actually look at the subsectors that came up, NFT was number one, decentralized payments and platform and finance, but you can read down the list and see a whole host of other subsectors. These were tags that these companies used in the descriptors of the type of companies that they were running. And what was even more interesting was 80% of those companies were all software or platform companies. So in that conversation, that's really saying the future companies are all software platform orientated, using applications, using data, monetizing them, and using infrastructure that all of the people in this room enable. So the last thing I wanted to share was around the convergence of sectors. All these tech companies are cutting across sectors. Telcos are moving into banking, insurance, health tech, log tech, anything with the word tech in there. And what that really says to me are two things. Number one is the sector adjacencies are no longer so clear, particularly in Asia. Crossing over, an app that you use can be any sector now. It's not just one area of business. And the other message is data democratization. How do we use data more effectively? How do we move it in a way that helps us monetize? So really, in short, that was a really piece of interesting sort of research that we had done and shared with many of our audiences around the region. And it's something that we want to continue to work with all of you to help find ways of enabling the infrastructure that will enable all these future tech giants. So now I hand it over to you, Dave, and have on sharing some of your insights as well.
So just to draw a linear path here, obviously data applications, we all know digitalization, digital transformation, that's what's driving the future. And so the question is, where does all that data go?
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the results from the data gravity index that we built at Digital Realty. If you look right now, this is describing data gravity growth. So this is the intensity of growth of data. You can think of it as data creation and data processing and growth. And you'll see that APAC is at 153% CAGR. So this is actually the amount of data that's being created and that is the rate at which it's growing. So this is a very large number, obviously, year over year. What this really means is a lot of data is being really built, created, flowing through these systems, and growing at an incredible rate. That rate then translates to specific metros. So you can see here Singapore at 200%. You'll see Melbourne at 175%, Hong Kong at 177, and Jakarta at 211%, which is incredible growth. We actually did this by looking at the global 10,000. So this isn't looking at all companies everywhere or small companies. This is looking at very broad, large, global 10,000. And that focus is because those are going to be businesses that have a lot of interconnection. They have a lot of connectivity needs, a lot of data needs, a lot of storage needs, and a lot of processing needs overall. And so why is this growth happening, and what's really fueling it gets back to data. And in this case, we talk about the data creation life cycle, which is really about data creation, data enrichment, and data exchange. And so data creation, I've talked a little bit about. Data enrichment is that process of what happens once you've had data created and you've stored it or you've processed it and stored it somewhere. You want to do something with it. And that's really when data enrichment comes into play. So you can think about if you're trying to train artificial intelligence or a machine learning model or something like that, it requires a lot of data. There's a lot of data to do deep analysis or deep learning or any of these other kind of things. There's a lot of data being consumed for video, streaming video. All of these things end up consuming large amounts of resources, and their byproduct when you do data enrichment is yet more data, and you want to do things with that data, and that ends up being when you're going to move the data, hence talking more about data exchange.
So Dave, before you do the handoff, it would be helpful to explain data gravity.
Sure, so data gravity is the concept that data as it grows has an attractive effect, just like you would with, if you think of in a planet being attracted to another planet or something like that. This is the same thing, but data growing, and as it grows, it's attracting applications and services to use that data, and that causes more data to be created. That attraction is gravity, and it's caused by a need or desire for lower latency and higher bandwidth. So you want to be closer to the data, and you would therefore want to build an architecture centered around the data.
And the way that gravity works, where the force is stronger, when the object is closer, data gravity works similarly, right?
Absolutely. The closer you are, the more you're going to end up consuming that data and contributing to that data.
Okay. So as that data needs to be exchanged, we can hand things over to Jim.
All right. So good afternoon. My name's Jim Poole. I am a VP in the Global Business Development Organization at Equinix. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a piece of research we do every year to year and a half. So this is the 6th version of this. I'm only going to show you a couple of slides of what we're producing, and I think you'll find it interesting. So for context, Equinix's business model is built around the idea of building ecosystems, so allowing counterparties to more effortlessly communicate amongst themselves. And so because of that, what we've done is we manage 443,000 interconnections between counterparties in the facilities that we maintain around the world. And so if you have all of that interconnection data, what you can do is you can basically say, well, I know the A end, I know the Z end, I know where they're deploying, and I know how much power or how much space they're occupying, right? So that's the first thing, that interconnection profile. We can actually create profiles about customers according to what kind of customer they are. Then on top of that, we look at just market conditions. So this is where we buy research or commission research from folks like Darren, so that we can sort of correlate the profile of the customer and enrich that to understand in context potentially what it means. And then from that, we can build a predictive model, right? So that's all sort of what the GXI is. This is about 35 pages of data. You can just go to our website and look it up. I'm only going to show you 2 views of this because otherwise we'd be here all day. The first is just a global view of where we see interconnection going across 2 basic industry constructs. So one construct would be sort of the service provider side of the equation. So that's that, folks over there to the left. And then on the enterprise sort of side of the equation. So in our world, one of the things that we're tracking against is that, most enterprises are adopting what we would refer to as hybrid multi-cloud architectures. And so what that's doing is driving the demand for more interconnection, because your supply chain, whether you're buying something from a service provider or whether you're selling something to another counterparty, you have to connect to that counterparty in some way, shape, or form. So a 40% CAGR on a global basis is, pretty impressive given the base and the size of the number of interconnections that are going. Of course, on the service provider side, no surprise, you can see that the networks and the clouds, constitute the vast majority of that, and that's still growing at a pretty high clip in the high 30s. If you move over to the right-hand side, what you'll see is that enterprises are, rapidly adopting these kinds of architectures by industry, and you can see there that, it plays out across any number of industries. If you look at the very bottom, what you'll see is the number of locations and the number of cabinets on average that you see being deployed. And so what's interesting about that is you can look and say, hey, in the service provider space, an average service provider deployment, and of course this is an average, is something like 2.5 megawatts spread out over 8 or 9 metros around the world, right? And you see then the same thing sort of starting to reflect on the enterprise side. What's most interesting is the distinction, from my point of view, between core and edge. Cores tend to be very large metros where you've got most of the major clouds, most of the major networks located in the same location, and then edge locations tend to be where you'll have things like, cables may land there, but they're closer to user populations. And so what's interesting is in the core, you're growing at about 1.5 times the difference between core and edge. So edge is actually now starting to grow faster. And then when you move over into the enterprise side, the enterprises are growing even twice that, so 2.5 times what you would see between core and edge. And what we attribute that to is land and expand behavior of customers. What they're doing is they're moving workloads closer to user populations to give lower latency and better user performance. And then, finally, and we do this per region, so this is just the Americas, but, feel free to go look at the various different regions. A similar view, so now looking at core and edge, as I've just explained, but breaking that down by metros. And so you can sort of see where things are growing. Those circles underneath the bars are then distributions according to industry, right? So you can see how fast, a network industry or what portion of that metro do the networks compose as opposed to a hyperscaler, as opposed to an enterprise. And then down at the very, very bottom, you'll see a similar distinction between sort of, if you lump them into groups, how much interconnection is being generated by, say, a cloud versus a network versus an enterprise in that same metro. And it gives you a feel for the type of business that's transacting. So just to give you an example in here, one of the biggest core markets would be something like New York, right? And in New York, of course, what you'll see is a disproportionately large number of enterprises. That's algorithmic trading happening in the New York metro, right? As opposed to you go to, an edge market where you see a whole bunch of cables landing. You go to a place like LA, as an example, which has a whole bunch of subsea cables come in, much more on the network side of the equation. So.
Okay, thank you so much. To me, all this stuff is fascinating because there are counterbalancing forces, right? There's, in one dimension, a whole spectrum from high-performance computing and almost glasshouse data centers through enterprise data centers, co-location facilities, public cloud. And at the other end, or the other dimension, you have the hyperscale facilities run by the cloud providers all the way down to the edge that each of us carries in our pocket, and or IoT sensors, smart cities, smart homes, and so forth. So, Jim, you mentioned a few things about sort of relative growth, but I'd be curious to hear from the three of you, if you were to predict out 5 or 10 years, as we increase video capture density, we have federated machine learning, we have a bunch of things like high-resolution video sensors for smart cities or what have you. What are the implications? What do you see as far as the balance of where everything is, whether it's data residency, critical apps driving that, or implications on interconnection fabric?
Yeah, so from an interconnection perspective, and this is in the index, we do make predictions off of this. And so one of the things that we'll look at is to say, hey, if we look at the Fortune 500 style enterprises, that within the next 5 years, you'll quickly be getting to the point where 90% of those enterprises will have some form of hybrid multi-cloud architecture in some number of metros. It becomes table stakes for how an enterprise that's being successful in digital actually conducts business. And so you can sort of see that as a blueprint, across the industry. And we backtrace every single time we do one of these iterations of the index to make sure that our predictions are sort of tracking according to that. So we say that with a high degree of certainty.
Dave?
I think one of the big trends that we see is not only are we seeing hybrid architectures, as you were talking about, Jim, we're also seeing just a sheer amount of data requirements for projects and things that are happening, which kind of starts to talk more to what Darren has been talking about. The amount of data and the amount of processing being required in projects inside of the data center is growing exponentially. These projects are growing. When I mean exponentially, I mean an order of magnitude over an incredibly short period of time, over 24 months in some cases, or 24 to 36 months. And these are demands that are then placed not only on what's happening inside of the data center, but now you're trying to move chunks of that data to your other facilities or to a cloud or to multiple clouds. And it's really becoming a challenge to allocate the necessary resources with enough time in advance to stay ahead of things and not end up being stuck waiting, trying to assemble all the necessary requirements in the data center to be able to move forward with some of these projects. It's going to continue from our projections and from what we forecasted. This is going to continue many years into the future. It's not ending anytime soon.
Darren?
Yeah, I'd say the push towards the sector and the ecosystem within the sector and the adjacencies. So, for example, if you look at health and health tech, that world is very different with different, Epic, Allscripts, sort of CRM and ERP and all those systems connecting, visual data, all those things. Or you look at payments for banking. So when you compare those two, they talk to different vendors and systems within there. When you look at data and how that moves and how they monetize, the democratization of data across systems, so joining data. So I work a lot with companies like people like Snowflake who connect data within hyperscalers across environments, all that stuff. So how do I connect data versus just moving it all into one location? So I think that is going to be somewhere that picks up. And last but not least is data residency. So when you're moving into countries now trying to protect that with privacy and the regulatory and privacy concerns that come, countries are going to start to say, well, you need to have all this in country, not so much on-prem. So I think all of those factors are going to start to connect with where I see actually a lot of the conversations we're having here and with the people I'm speaking to is how do the infrastructure providers enable those ecosystems and work with governments and work with the businesses to basically bring technology solutions so they can monetize and provide value for citizens and for businesses and consumers.
So first of all, any questions from the audience? not one question. Wow, everyone has this completely down. So from my perspective, to kind of sum up what I think is going on here is that there is no single best solution that applies to every enterprise or SMB in every vertical all the time, right? So everything is changing and things vary by industry, whether it's algo or whether it's telemedicine or smart cities or Vision Zero. So the general rule perhaps that applies for all of these is that since there is no one-size-fits-all architecture, this mix, I call it the hybrid multi-cloud fog, you say hybrid multi-cloud infrastructure, but it's basically a mix of everything from private data centers through public and hyperscale through near edge and far edge, has a number of implications, and the boat is kind of tilting more towards edge, I think your data shows. And so what that all means is that, first of all, for the interconnection industry, it's great because it means that the more complex the underlying architecture is, the greater the need for interconnection, whether that be in terms of ecosystems or in terms of even corporate intranets. The second thing that it says is that the growth in software and digitalization, which we're all familiar with, but you so nicely characterized, really says that as software eats the world and data eats the world, there's a need for all these types of infrastructure to be present. So maybe with that, let me ask for questions one more time. We have a question. Yes, Dean.
Given what we're talking about here about sort of essentially distributed compute and data for the next decade or longer, who else is going to be in the position of orchestrator? Because on the flight on the way over here, I was reading a ton of stuff from people who one of the visions for 6G wireless is the wireless network will orchestrate compute. And frankly, I think they're going to turn up late to the party by 2030. I'm interested in the panel's view of who is going to be the orchestrator in chief or the conductor?
Well, I love the question. This was going to be my last. So, one of the things, since we're at a conference with a few networks in the room, and I came out of that industry before I got into the data center business. One of the things that I've talked with a lot of the large networking companies is they start to move away from sort of traditional siloed offerings like MPLS or Ethernet or public IP, more into a world that says, well, wait a minute, I need to take all of those underlying substrate technologies, connect them to some collection of both public and private infrastructure, and make all of that work. Today, to a large extent, a lot of that's happening by an enterprise trying to do it themselves. Increasingly, at least in my conversations, I take care of the NSP segment of our business. Most of the large networks that we are dealing with are trying to figure out how to introduce as much automation as possible to that experience for the end user. That doesn't to say that they'll be the only ones doing that, or there are not other ways of doing it, but I would say that as a trend, you're going to see sort of more network as a service offers that are inclusive of sort of all of the types of counterparties you'd want to connect to.
I'll just add a few things. I think it's a great point and a great question. I think the distributed compute is going to be something. So if you look at metaverse and the way that's playing out is really saying it's not the AR, VR, it's kind of like processing and, democratization. So we're moving away from hub and spoke software models to actually containerize where the actual app sits in the container. And so when the app goes out and it processes in the space, there's no central app anymore. It's all containerized. So there's multiple ways that this can play, and so therefore infrastructure needs to be able to go and say, well, I've traditionally done hub and spoke and central to decentral, but now it can be running on the edge, it can be running in a container, it can be running anywhere. And I think technology is going to move quite quickly over the next 5 years, and we'll see a lot of innovation, which is part of the reason why we're trying to see what's coming, because when you see what's coming at that point and where PE are investing, where companies are coming from and what problems they're solving, and technology will have to support that.
Well, I know what's coming. And what's coming is the next panel, since we're out of time. So, but with that, please join me in thanking my amazing panelists.